Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We've heard an incredible amount of noise from Republicans about alleged voter fraud, and from Donald Trump, who said, even after he was elected president, that millions of people had voted illegally. Now we have the reports from the men and women of both parties who supervised the 2016 general election all across the country. The consensus was overwhelming. Out of 137 million ballots cast, the number of fraudulent votes that occurred was close to zero. Trump's claim that millions of people voted illegally was preposterous. It was a lie. But what was demonstrably true was the continuing outrageous and often outrageously successful efforts by Republicans to prevent Americans from exercising their legal right to vote. The abhorrent practice of voter suppression is alive and well, and its shameful stain is spreading now that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been so disastrously undermined. We'll talk about this with my guest, Ari Berman, a senior contributing writer for The Nation magazine and author of the book, Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Ari, welcome.
Good to see you, Bob.
Thanks so much for coming in. So there's been all this talk about the Russian hacking and the selective leaking of information and how that might have affected the presidential election. But the vast amounts of systematic voter suppression that has gone on has not gotten nearly enough attention. And it seems to me that that must have had some impact on the results, even if we can't quantify it totally or accurately. Can you talk about the state of voter suppression in the U.S. right now?
Yeah, so the 2016 election was the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. In June of 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that states with the longest histories of discrimination no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government, partly as a result of that decision, partly as a result of laws passed in other states. 14 states had new voting restrictions in effect for the first time in 2016. And this included some very important swing states like Ohio, Wisconsin, Virginia. And I was actually in Wisconsin on Election Day, so I saw this firsthand. Wisconsin had a strict voter ID law that was in effect for the first time in 2016. And according to federal court records, 300,000 registered voters did not have strict forms of government-issued ID. Well, Trump only won the state by 22,000 votes. So again, we don't know how many people got the right ID, how many people tried to vote and didn't, how many people decided not to vote at all because they didn't think their vote would be accepted. All we do know is that the number of those who could have been disqualified from voting was far larger than Trump's eventual margin.
The folks who showed up, these 300,000 who didn't have strict forms of voter ID, what was the process they were supposed to go through at that point?
Well, basically, first off, everyone says, well, doesn't everyone have an ID? Doesn't everyone have an ID to vote? And,
No.
and the thing is, not everyone has an ID or not everyone has an acceptable ID.
Right.
So there were people in Wisconsin who moved from Illinois. Lots of people moved from Chicago to Milwaukee, for example. They have an Illinois driver's license. They have valid ID, but they don't have valid ID to vote in Wisconsin. Or people don't have a birth certificate. They were born at home in the segregated South. They're elderly. They never got a birth certificate, or they don't have access to their birth certificates because they're 90 years old at this point in time. So now they can't get an ID because they don't have access to underlying documentation they need. So what happened was, if those people showed up at the polls and tried to vote, they had to cast a provisional ballot, and they had to come back within a certain period of time to obtain the right ID. And not everyone was able to do this. I was with a 99-year-old man. 99-year-old man who biked to the polls.
Oh my goodness.
And he had his University of Wisconsin faculty ID. That was not accepted as valid ID. So they had to call someone in Wisconsin who was helping people get IDs. Luckily enough, she was available. She took him to the DMV. She got him a temporary ID. He went back to the polls and was able to vote with a regular ballot. But how many people didn't get that assistance? How many people didn't press ahead? We don't know, but I'm guessing, it was hundreds, if not thousands of people were disenfranchised in that one state alone.
I spent almost an entire career covering poor people, working class people, people who are struggling economically. And I can just tell you as a matter of fact, the number of people, one, who don't have driver's licenses, there's an awful lot of people who don't have licenses, and who don't have birth certificates is enormous. It's a tremendous number of people.
And the head of elections in Milwaukee said that he believes that at least several thousand people were prevented from voting because of the voter ID law. And he said they saw the largest drops in turnouts in the places they expected the voter ID law would have the most impact, was, as you mentioned, were lower income neighborhoods, where people were more transient, where there were more likely to be people of color who didn't drive, who relied more on public transportation. So it's easy to sit from 10,000 feet away and say, this wasn't a big deal. But if you're on the ground, if you understand the struggles that people are going through, you know that this kind of stuff had an impact. And it wasn't just voter ID. There were cutbacks to early voting.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's only one form of voter suppression. Go through them. Yeah.
So there were efforts, first off, to make it harder to register to vote. You had to show proof of citizenship to register in some states, meaning you had to dig up a passport or a birth certificate or naturalization papers just to be able to register, which lots of people don't have or certainly don't have easy access to when they're registering. Then they cut back the amount of time that people had to vote. So they would cut early voting, or they eliminated polling places on election day, or they purged the voting rolls, or they disenfranchised ex-felons, people who had served their time and still weren't able to vote. So voter ID gets the most attention, but it's only one part of a series of voter suppression efforts that have been pushed by Republicans.
Explain the purging of the voting rolls, because that was a big problem way back, I guess, in the 2000 election in Florida. That was a big deal. What happens when they start purging these voting rolls, and what's the stated reason for doing it?
Well, states can purge the voting rolls for all sorts of reasons. I mean, you want the voting rolls to be up to date. The problem is that when states inaccurately and aggressively purge the voting rolls, lots of people who shouldn't be purged end up being purged. So you mentioned Florida, which I know you wrote a lot about in 2000 and afterwards. What happened in Florida was that was a state that didn't allow ex-felons to vote. They did a massive voter purge because they claimed all of these ex-felons were illegally registered. The problem was, first off, the purge was totally inaccurate. People were being labeled as felons even if none of their data matched the voter registration rolls. Middle names, last names, race, sex information didn't match. And the second thing was this purge was discriminatory, both because of how Florida set it up and because of the discrimination in the criminal justice system. So African Americans were 11% of the electorate in Florida 2000, but 44% of those who were purged. And what happened was, after the 2000 election, when everyone was preoccupied with hanging chads and butterfly ballots, the NAACP, I know, right? We don't want to relive it, but the NAACP sued the state of Florida, and the state of Florida conceded that 12,000 registered voters were wrongly labeled as felons and prevented from voting. That was 22 times George W. Bush's margin of victory in 2000. So this stuff has an impact, particularly in close elections. And after the 2000 election in Florida, Republicans realized they could manipulate the country's voting laws to gain a partisan advantage.
It has an effect, and that's the reason the Republicans are so obsessed with voter suppression. There's a reason that it's one party that's behind all of this stuff.
Well, I think the parties have different theories of the electorate. And basically, I think Democrats believe they do better when there's a higher turnout and more people vote, generally speaking. And Republicans believe that because their electorate is older, whiter, and more conservative, they do better when there's a smaller turnout. So they're trying to restrict the size of the electorate. They saw what happened in 2008 and in 2012 when there was unprecedented turnout for Barack Obama. And they wanted to make sure that did not happen again in 2016.
And then, of course, there's always the racial component, because even when Barack Obama is not running, the black vote goes overwhelmingly to Democrats. I mean, that's just a statement of fact. And the Latino vote, not as overwhelming, but tends to go Democratic as well.
Well, and we saw that was really stark in 2016, because you had one candidate who was running as a candidate of the rising American electorate, of younger voters, of black voters, of Latino voters, of voters of color broadly. And then you had another candidate who basically was aligning with white nationalists, who was explicitly running on the white backlash vote.
Right.
Much more explicitly, as you know, than Nixon or Reagan or Bush or anyone else.
Which
had done
I thought
it
at the
beforehand.
time was outrageous, and this just goes beyond all of that.
This wasn't a Southern strategy. This was the strategy
Exactly, right.
of the Trump campaign.
Right. The Southern strategy, the whole idea was that you'd have dog whistles, that you wouldn't blatantly confront this stuff, that there'd be some subtlety.
Trump
to it.
just threw out the whistle altogether.
That's all over.
He said 1 billion Muslims were terrorists. He said 11 million people need to be deported. He continually said to black people, it's worse than it's ever been for you. What do you have to lose?
Hell,
You're living in hell. So, again, why does someone like that, he's not going to want to have a large turnout. His party's not going to want to have a large turnout of young people or of people of color.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's what happened. There was lower turnout in very important places like Milwaukee and Detroit, and Trump benefited as a result.
So you were talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Pushed and signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. That's half a century ago, which is kind of incredible to me. There's an awful lot of people who, today, who don't understand why that law was so important. So talk a little bit about why there was such a terrible need for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then how that changed the political landscape once that law took effect.
Well, you have to go back and think that throughout the segregated South, but really across much of the country, many African Americans and others were disenfranchised. In Selma, Alabama, which really became ground zero for the voting rights struggle, only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote. If you tried to register, you were told to name all 67 county judges to be able to get on the voting rolls. If you were lucky enough to even see a voter registrar, because you had a sheriff there who carried a bullwhip, who made sure that nobody got in the first place.
Right.
And so you had official tests, things like poll taxes and literacy tests. Then you had sort of unofficial means like violence and fraud that kept many people from voting. In Mississippi, only 6.7% of African Americans were registered to vote. And what we saw was that it was incredibly dangerous to try to register. There were people like the civil rights activists Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner, who went down to Mississippi for Freedom Summer and were murdered just for trying to register people to vote. There were people like John Lewis, who serve in the U.S. Congress today, that were brutally beaten, nearly killed, just for trying to register to vote. And so on the one hand, 50 years seems like a long time ago. On the other hand, every day I think about the fact that people like John Lewis walk around bearing the scars of Selma. And this wasn't that long ago. This is not ancient history. Many people are still alive today who went through it. And if we had completely solved these problems, we could just celebrate the Voting Rights Act.
Exactly.
But instead of just being able to celebrate it, it remains a struggle that is still ongoing.
Now, one of the reasons we haven't solved this problem, even after all these decades, is that so many conservatives, right-wingers, Republicans, a lot of the mainstream figures have been at war with the Voting Rights Act and the concept of voting rights in general from the very beginning. So you can go back to William Rehnquist, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and John Roberts, the Chief Justice now, who was a protege of Rehnquist. So talk a little bit about how they have tried for so long and have now finally succeeded in undermining the Voting Rights Act. And what was their rationale for this obsessive opposition?
Well, the Voting Rights Act was remarkably successful. It really did work. I mean, it struck down things like poll taxes and literacy tests that people had been trying to get rid of for years. There was a tremendous jump in voter registration as a result of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, the number of people that were registered in Selma, Alabama alone was incredible. I mean, you're talking about millions of people being registered because of this law. And then there was a significant jump in representation. That you had the first African Americans and the first Latinos and the first Asian Americans, and in many cases, the first women or the first moderate whites ever elected as a result of this law, too. And the success of the Voting Rights Act spawned a backlash. That the first stage of the backlash was by the typical white segregationists, people like George Wallace who didn't like the law. But then there was kind of a second generation backlash that was more sophisticated. That was people like John Roberts, who came of age really first when he clerked for Justice Rehnquist, who had a very long record of opposition to civil rights. But then Roberts worked in the Reagan Justice Department in the 1980s as a young lawyer. And this was kind of his education when it came to civil rights. And basically what Roberts believed was that the Voting Rights Act was going to lead to quotas for African Americans and Latinos and other minorities when it came to electoral politics, that it was a form of affirmative action in the electoral sphere, that it was going to be intrusive to local government. So he was making a number of different arguments, kind of a typical states' rights argument, but also kind of what became known as color blindness or reactionary color blindness. The same arguments that were being made about busing and affirmative action and all of these other things after the 1960s was also made about the Voting Rights Act. And so in June of 2013, in February of 2013, when the Supreme Court hears a challenge to the Voting Rights Act, and Antonin Scalia says that the Voting Rights Act has led to a perpetuation of racial entitlement, a really unbelievable and outrageous statement, he is just making really a more blunt version of the argument that someone like John Roberts has made against the Voting Rights Act for 30 years. And of course, it was Roberts that wrote the majority opinion gutting the Voting Rights Act. So what we see is that
this is in 2013.
That his cause in the 1980s remained his cause 3 decades later when he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
And then he succeeded because now it is just, I don't know, I think almost impossible to enforce the Voting Rights Act, certainly in the way that Johnson and the legislators intended.
Well, it is, because the states with the longest histories of discrimination had to approve their voting changes with the federal government for nearly 50 years. And now they don't have to do that. So the federal government lost the most important tool that it had. It can still file suit against states like North Carolina, but it's a much longer process.
And very tedious.
Very tedious. And the burden of proof is on those facing discrimination as opposed to those doing the discrimination to prove that they're not discriminating.
So now this whole voter suppression landscape is clearly a direct assault on democracy. I mean, the right to vote is such a fundamental right in our kind of society. Why do you think it hasn't gotten, even though there have been a lot of stories about it? I mean, you've been on the case, but for the most part, people have not been on the case, and the coverage does not have a tone of outrage about it. Why do you think that is?
I think the media, and when I say the media, I largely mean broadcast and cable news, because that's unfortunately where a lot of Americans still get their news from. They decided this was a fringe issue as opposed to a fundamental issue. There were 26 presidential debates and not a single question about the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. They couldn't find 2 minutes over the course of 2 years to ask about this, including when they held debates in places like Wisconsin or Virginia or North Carolina or Ohio, where this was an ongoing issue. And I think they were kind of afraid of this for a few different reasons. One was because this was about partisanship. Republicans were doing this to Democrats, and they didn't want to seem too partisan. The second reason was this was about race. And a lot of the media were afraid to say that white Republicans were doing this to black and brown voters. That it was, I wasn't afraid to say it because I knew it was happening, but people in influential positions were afraid of it. And then I think they thought, well, it doesn't really matter. Like, we all have IDs. We're not going to wait
so
for 5 hours. It's a class issue. We're not going to wait for 5 hours to vote. Our polling place isn't going to be cut. So let's just talk about polls. Let's just talk about emails. Let's not go to Milwaukee. Let's not go to North Carolina. Let's not spend time and money doing the reporting. Let's just sit in the studio and regurgitate the same talking point for 2 years. And so there was a breakdown by the media on lots of issues. It wasn't just voting rights, but the fact that voting is what underpins the entire democratic process, you'd think they would have taken attacks on it a little bit more seriously.
I agree. So we've had these very serious attacks on democracy. I mean, we mentioned briefly the Russian hacking and the release of information, and of course the voter suppression that we've been talking about. And then we now have this bizarre situation in North Carolina where a Democrat in a very close election defeated the incumbent Republican and Walk us through what has happened since then.
Well, this is really unbelievable. I mean, this is the most unbelievable, insane power grab that I've seen since I've been covering voting rights. Because what happened was North Carolina narrowly elected a Democratic governor, the only state that went for Trump that elected a Democratic governor in 2016. And they just took away his power. I mean,
because the incumbent governor is a Republican, and he's got a Republican legislature, so they could pass these laws.
So they could pass these laws.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of things the North Carolina Republican Party did before this. We should mention things like they gerrymandered districts in violation of the Voting Rights Act. So they themselves were representing districts that were unconstitutional. They passed the country's worst voter suppression law in 2013, a month after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. They spread bogus claims of voter fraud throughout the election and after. But once the Democrat Roy Cooper was elected, they stripped some of his most important powers. They took away his ability to appoint a majority to the State Board of Election and 100 local county boards of elections, which is so important because North Carolina has passed so many voter suppression efforts.
Right.
These boards of elections are constantly hearing challenges over what the voting laws should be. And in 2016, there were Republican majorities, so they upheld things like closing polling places and reducing hours. Well, with a Democratic majority, they were going to make it easier to vote. But now these boards of elections are deadlocked. But here's the kicker. The State Board of Elections will be chaired by a Republican in all even-numbered years.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, guess what happens in an even-numbered year, like 2020?
Yeah.
Congressional elections, statewide elections, presidential elections.
Right.
So that's one thing they did. They took away the governor's ability to appoint people to boards of universities like North Carolina, which Republicans have attacked. They took away his ability to name state employees. So previously he got to appoint 1,500 employees. Now he only gets to appoint 500. Things that they did simply because he's a Democrat. So I and others have been calling it a legislative coup.
Right.
It wasn't a military coup. They did it through theoretically legal means, even though I think it will be challenged in court. But it was a coup because there's no other justification for taking away this person's power other than the fact that you don't like which party he's from.
Yeah.
You don't believe that he should be able to exercise the constitutional powers inherent in that office.
So you have one party taking away the power of officials elected by a majority of the people of the state.
It's unbelievable. And, you know, I really thought back to the whole battle over the Supreme Court after Scalia died. Because Republicans kept saying the next president should name the Supreme Court vacancy, even though that was a totally ridiculous and unprecedented argument. But then in North Carolina, the next Democratic governor, once he was elected, was immediately stripped.
Yeah, because logic
power.
means nothing. I mean, it's completely partisan. It's all about power grab, and it's all about institutionalizing their power, which is to say, to undermine democracy. We don't want the voters to have the right to elect people who will make changes in the way their government operates.
So I've been thinking for a while that we're in a serious constitutional crisis.
I agree with you.
I mean, first off, we have a president who lost by 2.9 million votes and is going to get to assume the office. So I think that's in and of itself a crisis.
Right.
Then you have the fact that we just came out of an election that was completely, I don't want to say rigged, but was certainly in lots of different ways influenced by events like voter suppression. Then you have the fact that Obama wasn't able to...
we should say improperly influenced.
Yeah, improperly
influenced in ways that should never happen.
Yeah. Then you have the fact that Obama wasn't able to fulfill one of his most constitutional rights, which was the appointment to the Supreme Court. Then you have the fact that even after someone's elected legitimately in North Carolina, his powers are taken away. So I don't know how we can look at all of this stuff, even one of them, but certainly all of it put together, and say that we're living in a functioning democracy at this point in time.
I agree, and we're running out of time, which is too bad because I'm going to have you back just to talk about the press. I just think that we are in a crisis here, a crisis of democracy in the United States, and it is not being covered as such. And I think that's a great failure of the press. But it is not a failure on your part. I think you're doing some of the best work of the press in this country right now. Ari Berman,
thank you so much, Bob.
thank you for coming in. I appreciate it. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. I've been saying for years that the American dream is on life support. The notion of a secure middle class and the steady economic advance of one generation after another is not even close to the American reality anymore. And now comes more concrete evidence of that fact. A defining aspect of the American dream has been the belief that children will do better socioeconomically than their parents. But a team of researchers from Stanford, Harvard, and the University of California has found that only about half of today's 30-year-olds have been able to earn more money than their parents did at a similar age. That is a shocking difference from the early post-World War II decades when upward mobility was taken for granted in America and the American middle class was the envy of the world. In those decades, nearly all 30-year-olds earned more than their parents had been able to earn at a similar age. In terms of living standards, America is going backwards, except for the very wealthy, who of course are doing fabulously well. Inequality is not a sexy word, but consider this. In 1980, just before Ronald Reagan became president, the top 1% in America earned about 27 times more than the typical person in the bottom half of our economic divide. Now, as the New York Times has reported, instead of 27 times as much, that top 1% earns 81 times as much as the typical person in the bottom half. So let's shift metaphors. With that kind of disparity, most kids chasing the American dream will never catch up to it. Maybe your kids or grandkids will be among the lucky ones, but if they are, they will have to overcome some pretty heavy odds. Most of our younger Americans can wave goodbye to that heralded dream. That's all for now. See you next time.